The Wake of the Bellerophon by T.B. Dahl. Chapter 1. Summer 1782 in Greystone House. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Lieutenant James Oxenham had already discovered that a man could stand upon a quarterdeck under enemy fire with tolerable dignity, yet become entirely useless in his own parlour, because a woman he loved was upstairs giving birth. This was one of the Navy's less advertised humiliations. James walked from the hearth to the window. 9 strides, he turned. 9 strides back. The parlour floorboards had begun to complain beneath him. They had endured muddy boots, dragged firewood, spilled cider, a dropped pistol, 3 Christmas quarrels, and 1 visiting cousin with a wooden leg. They did not approve of being paced into submission by a half-pay lieutenant who had no orders to give. Above him, Anne Oxenham cried out. James stopped so sharply that the gin glass on the side table trembled. He did not touch it. 13 years at sea had taught James that spirits could assist a man in many false ways, but never in the way required. Gin might make a coward loud, a fool affectionate, or a philosopher damp around the eyes. It could not climb the stairs, take Anne's pain, or command the child into the world by signal flag. Outside Greystone House, the August light still lay warm over Newton Ferrers, gilding the limestone cottages, the church tower, the leaded panes, and the slack water of Newton Creek. The tide had ebbed, leaving shining pools along the strand like broken mirrors abandoned by careless giants. Down by the boat cellars, tar, hemp, salt, and old fish rose in the heat with the steady confidence of smells that had been there before any living man and expected to remain after him. Then the weather changed its mind. A wind came crawling up from the Yelm estuary. It touched the lavender in the front garden. It worried the apple leaves. It found the chimney, slipped around the slate roof, and pressed its cold fingers beneath the eaves. James looked toward the small parlour window. Beyond the high hedge banks, beyond the barley fields, beyond the village roofs, a bruise-coloured bank of cloud had lifted over Plymouth Sound. Not now, James said. The weather took no notice. Weather seldom does. It receives a great many human petitions, and answers most of them with rain. Greystone House stood on rising ground above the creek, squat and grey and honest, with small defensive windows that had stared down a century of southwesterly weather. It had been built by men who believed comfort was a form of weakness, and that a wall should be thick enough to discourage both winter and Frenchmen. The house belonged to the Devon hillside, as naturally as the granite outcrops, and the blackberries still hard in the hedge. The first roll of thunder came low and far away. James listened. So did the house. The chimney gave a small cough. The rafters creaked. From upstairs came Mrs. Honor Yeo's voice, calm and practical. "Bear down with the next one, my dear. That is it. That is very well." Anne made no answer that could be called language. James resumed his march. 9 strides, turn. 9 strides. He had known storms. He had known a lee shore in a black squall, with canvas cracking like artillery and the sea climbing over the waist as though determined to enlist. He had known the sickening drag of a ship missing stays, the instant when every man aboard listened for the answering pull of wind in the headsails and did not breathe until the bow paid off. He had stood with one hand on a carronnade's breeching rope, while splinters flew thick enough to make a carpenter weep for professional reasons. But there, at least, a man could do something. He could shorten sail. He could brace sharp. He could put the helm a-lee. He could shout himself raw and pretend noise was command. Here, in the parlour of Greystone House, James Oxenham had been reduced to waiting. Waiting was an occupation designed by the devil for officers on half-pay. The mantel clock ticked. It ticked again. It continued ticking with a discipline James found personally offensive. Above, Anne cried out once more. James's right hand closed behind his back, thumb rubbing the scar across his knuckle. He had received that scar in the Caribbean, where a Spanish splinter had opened him neatly during a cutting-out expedition. The surgeon had sewn him without tenderness, which was the accepted professional standard. James had not made a sound then. Now he swallowed twice and stared at the ceiling beams as though he might interrogate them. "Hold fast, Annie," James whispered. The stairs creaked. James turned so quickly his coat skirt snapped against his legs. Grace Luscombe descended with a basin in both hands. The water inside was pink. Grace carried it carefully, as if it contained a secret rather than evidence. She was 16, broad-eyed, quick-footed, and already familiar with the unreasonable arrangements by which people entered and left the world. Her apron was marked, her sleeves were rolled, and a damp strand of hair clung to her cheek. She dipped her knees in a hasty curtsy that nearly slopped the basin. James said, "Grace, speak plainly." Grace steadied the basin. "Mrs. Yeo says it progresses, sir." James waited. Grace added, "Mrs. Oxenham bears it bravely." "That is not plain," James said. Grace blinked. He heard his own voice and hated it. James drew breath through his nose, once, carefully, as though taking in the smell of powder smoke before a broadside. James said, "Forgive me. Is Anne in danger?" Grace's fingers tightened around the basin. "Birth is birth, sir," Grace said. It was an answer of appalling honesty. The thunder came again, nearer. The window rattled in its frame. James looked toward the sound. "And the child," Grace said. "The child comes stubbornly." "Of course it does," James murmured. "It is an Oxenham." Grace glanced up. For a moment the corner of her mouth moved. It did not become a smile. Smiling in a birthing room household was risky business. The Almighty might see it and decide one had become complacent. Grace said, "Mrs. Yeo sent me for fresh linen and more hot water. She says, sir, that if you are inclined to pray, you might do so usefully and elsewhere than the staircase." James stepped aside. Grace passed into the cross passage, quick as a boatswain's mate on an errand, and disappeared toward the hall kitchen. James stood alone again. Below his feet, the flagstones of the passage held the memory of generations: muddy boots, salt-stiff coats, baskets of apples, bundles of firewood, sailors' chests, the tread of women moving from scullery to pantry, from pantry to hearth, from hearth to bedside. Greystone House had witnessed births before. It had also witnessed shrouds laid out on tables. Houses kept accounts more accurately than families like to suppose. James looked at the gin. The glass looked back. He turned away first. Above decks, in the best chamber under the darkening roof, Anne Oxenham gripped the ropes of the bed, as if the bed had offended her and required restraint. Her hair clung in damp threads to her temples. Her chemise was soaked through. A lavender sachet hung from the linen press, bravely contributing a note of refinement to a room that smelled of sweat, iron, tallow, storm air, and the coppery truth of birth. The small window stood cracked open. This defied several village traditions, including the one that declared a draught during childbirth invited all manner of invisible mischief indoors. Mrs. Honor Yeo had opened it anyway. Mrs. Yeo had delivered half of Newton Ferrers and had buried enough bad advice to fill the churchyard twice over. The wind breathed through the gap and stirred the candle flames. Mrs. Yeo sat between Anne's knees with her sleeves rolled, her cap plain, her face weathered into that severe calm found in midwives, senior warrant officers, and certain old cats. Mrs. Yeo said, "With the next pain, Mrs. Oxenham. Not before. Save your strength." Anne's fingers clawed at the bed rope. "I have none." Mrs. Yeo did not look up. "Then borrow some from tomorrow." Anne gave a breath that caught and scraped. Grace returned with clean linen over one arm and a steaming jug in the other. The house shuddered as rain struck the roof. Not a patter, a blow, then another, then 1,000. The storm broke over Greystone House with the brisk authority of a press gang entering a tavern. In the parlour below, James heard the rain hit the slates and felt his shoulders draw tight. At sea, he would have been upon deck by now. He would have had the topsails reefed, the topgallant yard sent down if the glass had fallen hard enough, the best helmsman at the wheel, the master beside him, the leadsman calling soundings, if land lay foul. He would have stood with rain running off his hat brim, gauging the set of the sea, the strain in the braces, the angle of the masts, the temper of the ship. A captain, even a lieutenant commanding a small vessel, survived by noticing small betrayals before they became large ones. A rope too slack, a sail too full, a man too quiet. But Anne's battle had no visible rigging, only sounds, only the scrape of feet overhead, only Mrs. Yeo's low commands, only Anne's broken breath. James pressed his palms together behind his back until the knuckles blanched. The church bell rang the quarter hour. The note staggered in the wet air. By the changing of that long afternoon, Newton Ferrers withdrew behind curtains of rain. The boat sellers vanished first, then the lime kilns. Then the creek itself became a grey moving sheet, beaten flat and silver by the downpour. Gulls hung low over the water, indignant, as though rain were a clerical error. Greystone House endured. Its slate roof streamed. Its gutters gurgled. Its small windows blurred. Its chimney smoked downward once, changed its mind, and smoked upward again. Inside, the hall kitchen glowed with banked embers. The kettle hissed on the iron crane. Herbs hung from the beams and trembled each time thunder rolled. In the pantry, jars of preserved fruit sat in sober rows, indifferent to labour, storm, naval rank, and the continuation of the Oxenham line. In the parlour, James stopped pacing. He had heard something. Not Anne, not Mrs. Yeo. A different sound. A short, sharp note from Grace. Then silence, the kind of silence that does not arrive empty, but carrying something concealed beneath its coat. James crossed to the foot of the staircase. He put one hand on the banister. The old wood was warm from the day and slick beneath his palm. "Mrs. Yeo?" James called. No answer came. The rain hammered the roof. The thunder grumbled over the creek. James mounted one step, then another. At the top of the stairs, Mrs. Yeo's voice cut through the house. "Grace, hold her shoulders. Now, Mrs. Oxenham, now. Do not waste it," Anne cried out. James froze halfway up the staircase, one foot suspended above the next step. A midshipman once, aged 13 and absurdly brave because ignorance is the strongest armour issued to boys, James had climbed into a French privateer under pistol fire without pausing. Now he could not climb a domestic staircase because a midwife had said now. He stood there while the storm thudded around the house. He could see only the turn in the passage above. A narrow strip of candlelight moved under the chamber door. Grace said, "That's it, madam, that's it. Hold fast." Mrs. Yeo said, "Again." Anne said something too low to hear. Mrs. Yeo answered, "No, my dear. You may curse him later. At present you must breathe." James shut his eyes. His mouth moved. The prayer had no elegance. The Almighty, who had received many elegant prayers and seen what came of them, was likely accustomed to this. In the best chamber, Anne's body arched against the pane. Grace braced behind her, one arm firm across Anne's shoulders, the other holding a damp cloth that had long since ceased to be useful, but gave the hand something lawful to do. Mrs. Yeo leaned forward. The midwife's expression changed by 1 degree. For Mrs. Yeo, this was equivalent to a signal rocket. Mrs. Yeo said, "There you are." Anne whispered, "What?" Mrs. Yeo said, "The crown." Dark hair, a vain little creature already, showing his head and keeping the rest of himself private. Grace swallowed. Anne's eyes fixed on the ceiling beam above her. There was a knot in the oak, shaped like a closed eye. She had looked at it through the last hour until it seemed to be looking back with the ancient disapproval of timber. The thunder cracked overhead. The candle flames leapt. Rain blew through the cracked window in a fine spray. Grace said, "The window, Mrs. Yeo." Mrs. Yeo said, "Leave it. If the weather wishes to attend, it may stand at the back and keep quiet." Anne's lips parted. No sound came. Her hands opened, then seized the bed rope again. Mrs. Yeo's voice softened, not with sweetness, but with command. "Mrs. Oxenham, listen to me. When the next pain comes, you will bear down and send this child into the world. Not halfway, not politely, entirely. Do you understand me?" Anne turned her head a fraction. Grace bent closer. Anne said, "James." Below the landing, James heard his name. It struck harder than the thunder. He climbed the remaining stairs. At the chamber door, James stopped. The door stood half open. He saw the room in pieces. Mrs. Yeo's bent back, Grace's pale profile, Anne's hand twisted in linen, the dark wet ropes of Anne's hair, the candlelight jumping against the wall, the washstand, the basin, the storm-coloured window. He did not enter. A man might command a sloop in action, but there were borders even war did not teach him to cross. James said from the threshold, "I am here, Annie." Anne's eyes found the doorway. James placed one hand against the doorframe. He needed the wood more than the wood needed him. James said, "You have the weather gauge, my love." Mrs. Yeo said without turning, That is very nautical and no doubt helpful to admirals. Mrs. Oxenham now. The next contraction took Anne like a sea-striking broadside. Grace held her. Mrs. Yule bent close. James saw Anne's fingers whiten around the sheet. He heard the low, fierce sound Anne made. Not a scream this time, but something dragged up from beneath all gentility, all instruction, all manners, all the careful phrases taught to women who would spend their lives being told to endure quietly. The house seemed to draw in. The rain struck harder. The thunder rolled away over the fields. Then came a sound that did not belong to storm, house, woman, or wind. A thin, wet gasp. A pause. Mrs. Yeo said nothing. Grace said nothing. James did not breathe. The child did not cry. Mrs. Yeo moved quickly, too quickly. She turned the small body. Her hand rubbed. Her fingers cleared the mouth. Anne lifted her head from the pillow, and the effort made her whole frame shake. Anne said, "Honor." Mrs. Yeo's face remained composed. It was the worst thing James had ever seen. Grace clutched the linen to her chest. The rain filled the silence with its impertinent industry. Mrs. Yeo worked. Once. Twice. The little body jerked. A sound came from it, small, indignant, furious. The cry sharpened, climbed, and filled the chamber with the outrage of a person who had been warm, private, and perfectly supplied, and had now been dragged into Devon during a thunderstorm. Mrs. Yeo said, "There. A boy." Anne's head fell back. James's hand slipped down the doorframe. He caught himself before his knees betrayed him entirely. The baby cried again. It was not a noble sound. It was not musical. It was red-faced protest, raw and astonishing. It remade the house. The storm still battered the roof. The creek still churned below. The gutter still choked and spat. But Greystone House now contained one more human demand, and therefore the balance of the universe had altered. Mrs. Yeo tied and cut with practiced hands. Grace moved to the basin. Anne watched every motion, her eyes following the child with an intensity that made all other lamps in the room unnecessary. James remained in the doorway. His mouth opened once. No order emerged. This was perhaps fortunate. The Navy had regulations for hammocks, powder, prize money, punishments, rope, biscuit, salutes, and the acceptable number of guns with which to acknowledge a superior officer. It had nothing useful to say about a man's first sight of his son. Mrs. Yeo wrapped the infant in clean linen and inspected him with stern approval. Mrs. Yeo said, "A fine lad, 10 fingers, 10 toes, loud lungs, no respect for weather." Grace gave the smallest laugh, then bit it in half. Mrs. Yeo turned toward Anne. "Here he is, Mrs. Oxenham." Anne lifted both arms. Mrs. Yeo placed the bundle against Anne's breast. The child's cry faltered. Anne looked down. Her thumb moved once across the child's cheek, barely touching him, as if his skin might bruise under the weight of the world. The baby rooted blindly against her. Anne bent her head. Her hair fell forward and hid her face. James stepped into the room. Not like a lieutenant, not like an officer, like a man crossing uncertain ice. Anne looked up. Her skin had gone pale beneath the flush of labor. Sweat shone at her temples. A strand of hair clung to the corner of her mouth. She did not move to brush it away. Anne said, "Come here, James." James came. He sat carefully on the edge of the bed, as though the mattress were a deck in heavy weather and must be trusted only after inspection. The baby lay swaddled between them, ruddy, damp-haired, and deeply offended. One tiny fist escaped the linen. It waved in the air. James stared at it. The fist was smaller than the last joint of his thumb. It nevertheless appeared ready to challenge authority. Anne said, "He has your temper." James touched one finger to the child's cheek. The baby turned toward the touch and opened his mouth in a silent, outraged square. James withdrew his finger at once. Anne's mouth curved. James looked at his son again. Outside the window, lightning flickered behind the rain. Inside the room, the candlelight warmed the blue-white china in the cabinet, the oak boards, the clean linen, the tired faces of the women. The steam rising faintly from the basin. The ordinary things of the house stood around the extraordinary thing, and pretended they had expected him all along. James said, "Thomas." Anne looked at him. James kept his eyes on the child. "After my father." The baby sneezed. Mrs. Yeo said, "There, he's given his opinion." Anne whispered, "Thomas Oxenham." The name settled into the room. It did not explain the storm. It did not promise survival. Names never do. They are small flags planted on uncertain ground. James bent and kissed Anne's damp forehead. His lips stayed there for a moment longer than custom required. Anne's hand found his sleeve and held it. Mrs. Yeo began gathering cloths with quiet efficiency. Grace took up the basin. The storm moved eastward by degrees, dragging its thunder over the fields and away toward the dark line of trees beyond the village. Rain still fell, but now it sounded less like assault and more like retreat. By the next quarter hour, the house had changed its breathing. The kettle hissed below, and the gutters muttered. The newborn child made small, snuffling noises against Anne's breast. James sat beside them and watched each breath. He counted them at first, as he might count guns in a fog. Then he lost the number. For once, losing count did not matter. Later, when Mrs. Yeo had pronounced Anne tired but well, and Grace had carried away what must be carried away, James descended the stairs alone. He crossed the passage. He passed the parlour, where the gin still waited untouched and slightly reproachful. He opened the front door. The rain had slackened to a silver mist. The garden steamed. Lavender bowed under droplets. The stunted apple tree shook itself in the wind, dropping water in sudden patters onto the gravel path. Newton Creek glimmered below the hill, half hidden in rain haze, with the tide still drawing out toward the estuary. A boat knocked against its mooring. Somewhere a gull complained about arrangements. The village chimneys smoked again. James stepped outside. The damp air filled his lungs. He looked once toward the church tower, once toward the creek, once toward the dark clouds breaking apart over Plymouth Sound. Then Lieutenant James Oxenham, who had survived storms, broadsides, fever, Admiralty correspondence, and the private terror of a silent newborn, raised both hands to the wet evening sky. "A son!" James shouted. The words flew over the garden wall, across the lane, down toward the boat sellers and the water. "A son!" Birds burst from the hedge. A dog barked from somewhere near the main track. From a distant field a man called back a cheer, though it was impossible to know whether he had heard the news or merely approved of shouting. James stood in the rain with his arms lifted, laughing once under his breath. Above him in the best chamber, Anne Oxenham held Thomas against her heart while the storm crawled away over Devon. The child slept, for now. And down by the creek the tide kept pulling seaward, as tides do, taking with it silt, weed, rainwater, small secrets, and the first whisper of a future no one in Greystone House was yet wise enough to fear.
The story continues in the next chapter, so make sure to subscribe, leave a comment with your thoughts, and share this video with fellow book lovers.